Hello and welcome to this installment, the first installment of this term of the Interdisciplinary Research Seminar at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. I'm Ghassan Moazin, and I'm an assistant professor at the Institute and at the University of Hong Kong. So today we're very happy and honored to start off this term's Interdisciplinary Research Seminar with a fantastic speaker. Our speaker this time is Professor Tristan Brown. Tristan is SC Fang Chinese Language and Culture Career Development Professor at MIT. He works, as I think many of you know, on late imperial China and basically a time period between the 16th and the 19th century. He looks at the environment, religion, law, and science, and how these worked together and interacted basically in China. And he has held visiting fellowships at, amongst others, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and the University of Cambridge. And he has also published widely in journals. And what he's going to talk to us about today, very luckily, is his recent book, Laws of the Land, Fengshui and the State in Qing Dynasty China, which just came out last year with Princeton University Press. So we're looking forward to that very much. I don't want to take up any more time, but just a quick word on the format. So Professor Brown is going to talk for around 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we'll have around half an hour for questions and answers for Q&A. If you have any questions, please submit them already during the talk or thereafter during the Q&A period through Zoom, through the Q&A button, and then I will read them out in the Q&A during the Q&A period for you, for Professor Brown to reply to. But without any further ado, Tristan, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ghassan, first for organizing this, for your kind introduction. I also want to thank very much Li Ji, who I think also after a lunch last year, sometime at Harvard, MIT, said we should do this, and she made it happen. So I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for hosting me today. I have an ambitious plan. I'm going to try to give you some of the meat of my book, my recent book, and I'll try to do it in about 30 minutes. So what we're going to do is I always start out with what is feng shui, an academic definition. So let's get everybody on the same page with that. We'll talk about the book's intervention and argument. I'll talk a little bit about historiography and how the book makes an intervention in the history of law, legal history, and the history of science. And then I'm going to talk about specific cases that draw that out a little bit. I'll also, towards the end of the talk, I'll historicize the phenomenon of feng shui appearing in Chinese law through talking a little bit about environmental change and the crises of the 19th century. And maybe time permitting, I'll conclude, and time permitting, I'll talk a little bit maybe about feng shui today. But if we don't have time, that's okay. We can do that in the Q&A. So let's start out by talking about what is feng shui. I'm going to define feng shui in three different ways. I'm going to define it as a knowledge, I'm going to define it as a practice, and I'm going to define it as a discourse, or simply put, a way that people talked. So feng shui is a knowledge of orienting structures such as graves and houses in accordance with cosmological principles in the flow of qi. This is, of course, not the only definition one could give of feng shui, but it's a useful one that I find to just give here at the beginning. Okay, so if we break this down a little bit, I'm sure everybody in the audience is familiar with some of the key terms: qi, vital essence, an unseeable life force that runs through all matter. And this term, of course, underpins many of the traditional Chinese sciences, including Chinese medicine, right? So, of course, in Chinese medical discourses, we have these jingmai, right, or sometimes called luomai, bodily veins, oftentimes translated into English as meridians, channels in the body that carry qi. And the key thing about this is, of course, they're distinct from blood veins, which is why when an acupuncturist puts the needle in the skin, they don't draw blood, because they're focusing on these veins and not so much the blood veins. Well, similar to this phenomenon of jingmai or luomai in Chinese medicine is, you can see a diagram here, is earth veins, many, many different types of earth veins that appear in legal practice, lawsuits, and also, of course, in feng shui manuals. And those can also be diagrammed and analyzed, okay? So we have here the knowledge of feng shui. And when a feng shui master, when a specialist of feng shui puts this knowledge into practice, Feng Shui serves as something like the medicine of the land. So I think that the way to really conceptualize what Feng Shui was as a living body of knowledge in the late imperial era is to give that analogy with medicine, right? Medicine is a knowledge. Medicine is also practiced by specialists. But let's go to the final one, discourse, a way of talking. Here again, let's stay with the medical analogy for a minute. Medicine it suffuses the way we talk, right? I can tell my mom, Mom, you should, take this medicine. It's good for you. My mom can tell me, Tristan, you should, take this medicine. It's good for you. We mobilize this knowledge as a way of expressing care for each other. Neither of us might be specialists in it. In that kind of discourse, right, that Feng Shui as a way of talking, as infusing the popular discourse, is something that very much colored life in late imperial China. Okay, so with that analogy in mind, let's just expand on this notion of Feng Shui as a discourse for just a moment. I think that it's important to remember that Feng Shui in the Qing Dynasty tied nearly every level of Chinese society together, okay? From, of course, the imperial family, right? Mountain ranges, major rivers, watersheds, of course, imperial tombs, Long Mai, dragon veins, this whole sort of discourse of Feng Shui, the Feng Shui of the empire. But of course, not only the emperor cared about Feng Shui. For instance, many of the scholars who were taking the imperial examinations, participating in the examination system, they cared about city walls, pagodas, especially their heights, academies, temples, where their layouts were, where they were located, and related to examination success. So we have, of course, the gentry, the scholars mobilizing Feng Shui knowledge. And then finally, of course, which probably occupies the group that presented most of the lawsuits about Feng Shui in the Qing period, are just commoners, right? Commoners talking about the environments of their graves and houses, connected to the health of their children, their progeny, their health and financial well-being, okay? Now, just in one quick example, I just want to say, when you lay this out and say Feng Shui tied together every level of Chinese society, we do have to realize it was mobilized at so many different scales. Really quick example, okay? In addition to dragon veins and earth veins, there's also these, shengmai, right? A province can have, a dragon vein, a critical river system, or a mountain chain deemed to be connected to the fortunes of all the inhabitants of a province. So of course, many of the legal cases I will be talking about today come from Sichuan province in Western China. And in the late 19th century, the Governor General of Sichuan, Wu Tang, actually ordered the shengmai of Sichuan mapped and analyzed, annotated, because there was illicit clay mining around the provincial capital of Chengdu. And you can see actually this map right here. It's a really remarkable specimen I discuss in one of the chapters of the book. Just to give you a little bit of a sense, that highlighted area there around the Min River, the watershed of the Min River, and at the mountains as it comes down and envelopes Chengdu, is exactly what they're annotating there, as well as where the mining is occurring. So you can really see here, Feng Shui as knowledge, practice, and discourse was applied to real-world problems by people across Chinese society in the Qing Dynasty. Okay, let's talk about the intervention of the book. So one of the easiest ways to begin with the intervention is realizing one basic fundamental point. Feng Shui is an English word. This is actually a very, very interesting and even peculiar thing. Because if you think about it, there are, I think dozens of Chinese words that have come into the English language. In Feng Shui, Kung Fu, these words are certainly, Feng Shui is one of them. When did Feng Shui come into the English language? Well, it appears in the Encyclopedia Britannica, I think the 3rd edition, in the 1790s. It became increasingly used over the course of the 19th century. It appeared in newspapers. You see here the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune. You'll find this word in various newspapers across Western countries over the 19th century. And why was it being used? Well, in the 19th century, this century of high imperialism, diplomats, Western merchants, of course, missionaries were going to China, engaging in economic life in China, buying land, building churches, whatever, and they were getting sued because of Feng Shui. So they talked about it. So one of the big books published in 1873, Fengshui, The Rudiments of Natural Science in China by Ernest Johann Ittel, says Fengshui has a legal status in China. Law courts adjudicate cases on the presumption that Fengshui is a reality and a truth, not a fiction. This is actually one of the major things that these observers of the 19th century made note of, that it had a legal status. Max Weber himself picks up on these observations in his discussion of the religions of China, okay, and talks about feng shui. And of course, his whole sort of discourse is around capitalism. I'm not going to reinterrogate Weber here, but I'm going to make one basic point about this 19th century, early 20th century historiography, which is over the 1800s, many Westerners perceived feng shui as irrational, but important in China. I want you to take those two things together, keep them in your mind as we get into the 20th century. So what happens in the 20th century? There's a peculiar divergence, okay? Some people talk about feng shui, but they don't talk about law. Some people talk about law, but they don't talk about feng shui, okay? It's different than the 19th century situation. So what happens? The legal historians, the historians, they revise our understandings of Chinese law. They do a great job, okay? But what do? They tend to focus on the secular dimensions of Chinese law. So in other words, the law code, certain punishments, maybe, you know, how the state resolves certain types of disputes, marital cases, whatever. But all these cases that we were talking about, cosmology, divination, etc., wasn't really discussed that much. Now, who talked about feng shui? The anthropologists. Now, why did the anthropologists talk about feng shui? They even revised earlier impressions of feng shui. They did a pretty decent job. They did it because they went out to the field in Hong Kong, the New Territories, in Singapore and Taiwan, and they encountered it. But there was a caveat with this body of work. The context was the 20th century. It wasn't the context of imperial China with the emperor, the examination system, and all of those other trimmings that we have from the imperial period. So what does my book, my intervention, try to do? My book tries to build on a growing body of work, reuniting law and cosmology and religion in Chinese history. You have Paul Katz, who's looked at divine justice. He finds law in Chinese religion. You have Zhang Yonglin, who finds religion in Chinese law, even the law codes. And now we have laws of the land, feng shui in the state in Qing Dynasty China, that sees law and feng shui not as an oxymoron of rational and irrational, but as two sides of the same coin that are mutually constituting each other. Okay, law influences feng shui influences law. Okay, and the key is how people mobilized it. So the book's argument is as follows. The Qing state consciously accorded a space in legal practice for the consideration of feng shui claims. That space needed to be there. The final sentence there is the key point, okay? It does not mean that the Qing state loved feng shui lawsuits. Remember, the Qing state will always say they dislike all lawsuits. They never like lawsuits, okay? But they consider it. That's the key point. They don't have to always agree with it. Many times they'll disagree with the feng shui interpretation, but they'll tell you what the real feng shui is. We'll get to that soon. Second, this is the historiographical, the historical context of the first claim. During the 19th century, in demographic, environmental, and political stresses in China elevated the status, the salience of feng shui in Qing law. And that, once you understand point two, and we'll get to that at the end of the talk today, some of those Western writings going all the way to Weber, I think will make more sense. Not to say we will agree with them, but we'll contextualize them. All right, so I think most of the audience here does not need an overview of the legal system in Qing Dynasty China, but I'll just say, just to have it on record for everybody, the written law code of the Qing, the Da Qing Lu Li, largely concerned criminal matters. There were relatively few statutory laws for property matters. Every county, had a magistrate and who was responsible for hearing the county's administration responsible for the county's administration in hearing lawsuits. Okay, so that's, the basics. And then I think here's really the key point, which is by the Qing period, endangering feng shui or harming earth veins was a recognized claim in law courts. In other words, people are going to go to court. They're going to say their feng shui was disturbed. They're going to say their children had fallen ill. And the magistrate or the muyo or the clerks and the runners, nobody is going to be shocked. Nobody is going to go, what are you talking about? How could they know it? They know what's coming. They have a lot of these cases. I'll show you that in just a second. Before moving on, let's first address how were earth veins or feng shui damaged? Through looking at legal cases from the Qing Dynasty, as well as some memorials, routine memorials for the Board of Punishments. I have identified 4 major ways in which feng shui was disturbed. It's not to say that these were the only 4 ways, but these were the 4 major genres that I've seen. The first, cutting down a tree deemed to be connected to feng shui. The key point here is that these trees around grave sites, around temples, around even sometimes houses, injai or yangjai, mattered a lot to people. So as I mentioned, the people saw trees often as connected to their health, their family's health, or even their children's health. There are many reasons why trees were so essential in the 19th century, not only resource scarcity, timber scarcity, all of these things. Kenneth Pomerantz has talked a lot about this in the North China Plain, for instance. I just want to say, from my reading of the legal archive, I would point out most people in the Qing Dynasty who were buried did not have a tombstone. Tombstone tended to be reserved for elites, relatively well-off people who could afford to chisel one. People often were laid out in a grave site, which is to say there were a lot of tombstones, but I'm just saying for instance, in Sichuan, what we see is these cemeteries, people laid out in a specific order, and trees grow around the dead. So the trees give you information. They tell you where the dead are buried. Now, another way to, of course, disturb feng shui is you mine a mountain deemed to be connected to feng shui. That can be bad. You can also change the direction of important water flows, of course, irrigation systems, things like that. You see a lot of feng shui lawsuits coming into court regarding water. And of course, building something that local residents don't like. And that's something I'm sure we can all relate to. This is maybe the part of feng shui that is still actively practiced in California and beyond today. Okay. So one question that people often ask me is, were there really a lot of feng shui lawsuits? Yes, there were. There really were. Let's listen. If you don't believe me, let's listen to Zhou Renji, right? He says something very interesting, right? 本次煤气放告，中风水者居其半, right? Every season that this office opens for lawsuit submissions or petition submissions, people contesting feng shui present half the plaints, okay? Half. This is not uncommon. In the gazetteers of Huizhou, other provinces of South China, you will see kind of phrases like this. Feng shui disputes are half of all lawsuits. Now, I don't take that at face value. I don't want you to think I'm saying, oh, half of the lawsuits are about feng shui. Now, let me just ask though, considering how common these phrases were, are half of our legal history books about feng shui? No, they aren't, right? So this is an opportunity, right? When I saw this and I kept on seeing this, I realized, wow, this occupied a lot of legal practice. So it is worth talking about. So I use in this book 500 legal cases from Nambu County, Ba County, as well as Taiwan, as well as Beijing, right? So some of the palace collections, some of the local collections. I also use maps drawn to record or investigate feng shui. These are fascinating specimens, and we can talk about them in the Q&A if you'd like. And I think some of the most interesting sort of sources that I use in the book, unconventional, are feng shui manuals. These are technical specialist manuals to tell people how to practice feng shui correctly. What I found when I started to read them was that they are filled with legal information. So this is about finding the roots and sources in knowledge of law outside of traditional legal sources. And let's take a look right now. So one genre of feng shui case that you will definitely encounter in the Qing Dynasty is oil press shops. Oil press shops were contentious sites, and feng shui manuals, such as this one, published in Hangzhou in the late 18th century, have a lot of advice about where you should situate houses and what areas you should avoid. You definitely should avoid youfang. Sometimes they'll say like, jia you de difang, right? Places where the oil was pressed. Realize that oil pressing was very labor intensive. It was very loud. It produced a flammable object that literally could produce fire. And people were aware that these sites could be potentially dangerous. So they appear in feng shui manuals as inauspicious sites that need to be carefully selected, potentially avoided. Now, we have a case in Ba County about one of these places. There are many such cases of this, actually, that I found over the course of the last 10 years of researching this stuff. And this is a legal comment that you'll find from a local branch yamen, basically saying, I investigate that your oil shop was set up at the head of the market town and disturbed the feng shui or the vein of the entire town. The branch yamen urges you to choose another place to set up your shop. What is going on here? What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that basically there was a merchant, he established an oil press shop, there was a controversy in the town about its location. He goes to the court, okay, and the court says to him, find another place. And when they tell him to find another place, they are not making stuff up. They are not simply saying, oh, I just don't feel like it. People knew that in feng shui manuals, this was a recognized principle. And I encourage all of our, any of you who are interested in this subject, take a close look at gazetteer maps of county towns, and you will find that 加油街, places where the oil was pressed, are outside of the walled towns. I've yet to find an example of one inside the walled town, because of course they're flammable and they could burn down the yamens, the schools, and the academies. So they tend to be zoned outside of the towns. Something to check out when you're looking at a gazetteer next time. Okay, take a look at another type of case going back to the question of trees, right? I mentioned feng shui trees around grave sites being very important, providing information for the state as they adjudicate these cases. The problem, of course, was that people did create fake graves, right? They buried animal bones in other people's land. And they say, look, that's my ancestor. You owe me money. You can't touch it. All of this stuff like that. So you have a question. You're not allowed to open a grave to actually examine the corpse, right? That is against the law. So how is a court, this is a legal sort of quandary, how is a court supposed to determine whether or not a grave is real or fake? Well, one way that I saw several times in one county, Nambu County, was that they would investigate the feng shui. So for instance, you have here two branch families or lineages living side by side. Some cemetery land or land adjacent to a cemetery was sold to the neighbor some 50 years earlier. That family never wanted to depart with that land or always regretted doing it. So one night they cross the boundary and they create 5 fake graves on the other side on the land that they had previously sold decades earlier. The magistrate takes the case and he notices, based on the clerk's map of the site, that there are no trees around these fake graves. So of course I have this line in the book, because the dead can't talk, the trees did the talking, okay? And that's actually what you see in some of these cases. This is an example. How about one more example? Everybody I know is kind of interested often in houses, right? Feng shui and the feng shui of residences, okay? Similar principles at play. Okay, you have feng shui manuals devoted to auspicious houses and inauspicious houses. Look at an example here. We have an inauspicious house, a house where the front is high and the rear is low. Okay, now I want you to remember this principle. If you have a house like this is an inauspicious house, not good, bad things are going to happen. This principle is important because once again, we'll see this principle invoked in a legal verdict. Okay, so you have a Wang family, which is perhaps a joint family or a lineage who lived in Sichuan. They had a sort of old courtyard, something, partial courtyard that had existed for many decades. And a sort of subsection of the family added a room in front of the central hall. This angered certain members of this Wang lineage. And they went to court and they said, our feng shui is disturbed. We are really, really worried about what's going to happen here. The magistrate takes, of course, they take the case, the clerk maps it out, the clerk provides an analysis of the house. It's an incredible analysis. And the magistrate ultimately rules that the feng shui of the site was not disturbed. But how does he determine that? He says, look, this is fascinating, right? He says, 唐禹 right, 王国顺等商年在元把前面修造房屋爱于中堂和言有爱人口, right? This phrase, he is drawing on this feng shui principle, the jurist, in order to say, no, it isn't disturbed. But of course, he still says, for good measure, you can move the house. You can move the, please still move, of course, the room, right? We want to keep peace in the family. So over these three cases, you can see the principle of feng shui being disputed, the state intervening, and how does the state intervene and solve the case? They rely on feng shui knowledge, okay? I'll just say finally here, on this house example, for those of you who are interested in the history of Chinese architecture, that you will in fact notice that in many temples and many old houses and everything, that the rear of the house tends to be the highest point or is certainly more elevated than the front. This is like a very consistent pattern that you see in feng shui manuals and in actual building practices. Okay, let me now say something about the technical knowledge of feng shui. Because feng shui was a knowledge of expertise, like medicine, it necessitated technical specialists. And one thing that, I point out in the book is that there were actually low-ranking officials that the government hired based on their knowledge of the calendar, divination, astrology, and feng shui, these yin-yang shui guan. You actually find their job descriptions in the Da Qing Huidian. And in Ba County and in Nambu County, you can see many of the ways in which they participated in local administration. Uses of the calendar, mapping, interpreting uses of the compass, so on and so forth. And right here, I just want to point out something regarding this intersection of the history of law and the history of science, which is to say, think about our legal systems today, okay? We still, we use, quote unquote, forensic scientists who mobilize scientific knowledge in unscientific ways. Look, go into an American courtroom. Look at a murder investigation. The prosecution will find a scientist who says, I've looked at the DNA, I've looked at the fingerprints, and it's definitely, this person was pushed down the stairs. And the defense will find a scientist who will say, no, I've looked at the same evidence and I conclusively, confidently say he naturally fell down the stairs, okay? Well, that's not exactly the scientific method, okay? But there's a reality that is kind of a bug in the system. Their presence allows the law to work. The law relies on these specialists. They rely on this knowledge. It doesn't matter if it's perfectly in line with scientific method. It has to have these legal and political uses. All right, now I'm going to have, let me just check out my time. I think let's say about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try to get you through. So the question of who knew feng shui? This was a question that I constantly came up, as I was researching this book. Who actually really knew it? Well, one answer was these specialists. But then I realized there was another group of people who seemed to know a lot about feng shui. Okay, and it was a group of people I wasn't initially even suspecting. So it has to do with the imperial examination. You know how competitive the imperial exams were in the Qing Dynasty. Less than 1%, passed and went on to become officials. Very, very low passing rate. Millions of people were taking it every 3 years or whenever the exams were offered. And people saw a link between examination success and good feng shui. Okay, so who else knew feng shui in Qing society? Government officials. They were wealthy. They had passed the exams. Who knows feng shui? Who has good feng shui? It doesn't matter whether or not they believe in it, right? Everybody in the local society thinks they know about it, right? Thinks they must have some secret. That's the major reason why people sought out their opinions and the reason the government could adjudicate these cases with confidence. So here's the key point. Feng shui enabled people at the bottom of the power structure to protest to their superiors, while their superiors retained the power to make the final decision. That's why Feng Shui was not illegal. It was not super controversial. Officials aren't scared when they get a Feng Shui lawsuit. They know what's up. This is an appeal to them, and they can intervene and help the people if they want, right? Either by recognizing Feng Shui or denying Feng Shui, but they have that ultimate power of interpretation. That's why Feng Shui could work in the law as the law. I'll say one more final point about this that I think some people in the audience might find very interesting is, how does the government know where good Feng Shui is? Well, this is actually from the official, the Qing Tianjian Bureau of Astronomy, their correct doctrines of Feng Shui. They actually looked to the results of the examination system and looked to case studies from across the empire and across Chinese history to see who had become Zhuangyan, right? And what kinds of grave sites and what orientations did they have, right? So this is a really fascinating window. And I think that much more research could be done on this. It's not that the top determines, the central state determines what the good Feng Shui is and tells everybody. The central state also collects information from the localities. Where is the good Feng Shui? What is it? What is a good grave site? What are some good examples? They're looking for case studies. Okay, so Feng Shui's roles, this is now I'm getting to the final parts of today's talk. Feng Shui's roles in Qing law were not static. Okay, many Qing officials perceived an elevation of Feng Shui-related anxieties around the turn of the 19th century. What's going on around the turn of the 19th century? Well, I think many of you know what's going on around the turn of the 19th century. Sichuan province, which earlier in the dynasty had lots of available land, has run out of new farmland. You have growing pressure on the land. You have growing pressure on limited natural resources. And people are starting to, talk about these issues, as many of you know, right? From, Hong Liangji and other Qing officials, right? Talking about the potential implications of this. I put this I leave this to your attention because it contextualizes and helps explain something very important, what happens next. After the Opium Wars, as all of you will know, China entered into this, big situation of industrialization. Should we industrialize? How do we industrialize? What should we do? And you have these, persistent efforts across the 19th century. Well, what's fascinating, of course, is that in these nascent efforts, particularly in the 1860s and 1870s, many Qing officials opposed the building of telegraphs and railways and cited Feng Shui as a critical reason, right? For instance, no less than a Qing official, Li Hongjiang, actually does this, right? In a memorial written in late 1867, read in early 1868, just after the Taiping Civil War. He, of course, goes on to change his position on industrialization, on building railways, but not every Qing official does. And I think what's really essential for understanding these officials' positions on this is the roles that Feng Shui was playing in the legal system through that time. And that's what my book helps, I think, to illustrate. So what I want to say here is that Feng Shui protests against industrialization in the late Qing were products of a specific moment in Chinese history. The demographic, economic, and administrative characteristics of the Qing were unique to the dynasty. So, of course, you can go to Dianshi Zhai Hua Bao, the famous Shanghai pictorial, and see this 1897 image of rail construction disturbing the feng shui of a famous mountain outside of Beijing. And believe it or not, just 3 years later, Boxer rebels destroying that exact rail line, okay, after the publication of that image, okay? So this was, not to say it was the only important thing in the late Qing, but it certainly was a big factor, and it certainly was an important issue of contention for legal practice and even for political stability. Okay, so let's go back to the argument of the book, okay? The Qing state consciously accorded a space in legal practice for the consideration of feng shui claims. That space needed to be there. I try to show you why the state needed to consider these claims, why the state had to engage these claims, okay? It was doing it, it was managing society, right? with its limited knowledge, right? I mean, you're a magistrate working in a local county. You don't know who exactly owns what land. You don't know if the contracts are forged or not. But what do you know? Besides, of course, the Confucian classics. Well, many of them evidently knew something about feng shui, which is how they could bring it into their administrative careers. During the 19th century, second point, demographic, environmental, and political stresses elevated the salience of feng shui in the law. Okay, so that leads us to one more final point that we can tie back into the beginning of the presentation with Edel and Weber and those folks. Western missionaries, diplomats, and even some intellectuals at the time noticed a real social phenomenon. They were not making stuff up. They were not, oh, feng shui has a legal status in China. It did. It actually did. Okay, so they weren't making stuff up, but they misunderstood feng shui. They misunderstood Chinese law, and they misunderstood why this was happening. I hope my book can help explain the why question. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop here. I think I'm at 33 minutes. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Tristan, thank you so much for the wonderful talk and for giving us such a nice overview of your book. And I'm sure that we'll have many questions. So just as a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out for Professor Brown to get back to you. Maybe I can start us off with a question that sort of talks to your last point about, or one of your last points about industrialization. Of course, there's been a bit of a sort of the question when it comes to particularly industrialization, railways. There's been sort of this old image of feng shui and that basically holding things back, and particularly Elizabeth Curl in a recent book on railways has kind of tried to push back against it a bit and said basically. These kind of sort of technological advancements and railway technology in particular were actually quite rapidly absorbed by the population. So could you talk a bit about what your perspective on this is in the sense of, I mean, you of course said, you just gave us this example of the boxes and so on, but railways were built in the end, of course. Li Hongzhang comes around. So how does that exactly happen? On what is your perspective sort of on that debate? That would be interesting, I think.
Well, yeah, let me just say that I really enjoyed Elizabeth Cole's work, Railways and I think Transformation of Modern China, Making Modern China. It's a great book. And I bring it into my discussion of chapter 5, actually. I draw on her. She's got some really good insights about the use of maps, because I talk about in the book how during feng shui disputes specifically, there were a lot of maps presented to the state. And we also see that practice being carried over for when the railways were being planned and constructed. There is no doubt about it, right? That the anti-development forces, they lose the debate in the end, right? Especially after 1895 and especially after 1900. And the Boxer disaster and so on. China, the late Qing, especially in its last decade, builds thousands of miles of rail track. But it's also important to recognize, which I think is not in contradiction with Elizabeth Cole's work at all, that those debates about whether to build rail or not went back to the 1860s. And they continued into the 1890s. And I do think it is important to recognize that either in palace memorials, in other kinds of memorials, and in local lawsuits, feng shui was a real source of both legal tension around those development projects as well as political tension. So you can look at it two ways. You can look at it and say, at the end of the day, yes, a lot of railways were built, especially in the last decade of the dynasty. You can also look at it from the perspective of, for 40 years, the Qing didn't build very many railways. Well, why? Right? And it's because, in a sense, the factions that were opposing those projects had good arguments. And what were their arguments? Now, what my book is trying to say to people is, feng shui is a good argument. It's not a crazy argument. It's not a superstitious argument. We look at California high-speed rail. How many years has that been planned for? right? We've been talking about California high-speed rail, I think, for over 20 years. How many miles of track have been laid? Is it because the Californians are so superstitious? No, it's because the Californians keep on bringing lawsuits against the projects, right? About land confiscation, about trees along the way. So I mean, this is actually very understandable. And I'm trying to show people, especially in that chapter, what were the stakes? Right? Yes, it is true. Of course, China had to industrialize. Of course, and China was going to industrialize eventually. But there was also a lot at stake in making those decisions. The state's legitimacy over the examination system and auspicious conditions for the examination system, the state's protection of the resting places of the dead, and the legal system writ large. Feng Shui in practice was related to several pillars of the Qing state's legitimacy, I believe. And that's why it was such a big deal at the end of the Qing. But thank you for that question. It's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
We've got our first questions. So the first question comes from Zhang Huaimin. And the question is, hello, my question is, do you see Feng Shui's role in the law during the Qing as unique to that era, or did it represent more or less a continuity from the Ming?
Oh, wow. This is a very good question as well. Oh, well, so let me just begin by saying what's really exciting about the state of the field right now is that there are historians. For instance, Hua Ye, I think we're actively working on a dissertation that's perhaps looking at Feng Shui, I believe. Yu Xin just finished a fantastic dissertation about Huizhou, I think of the Ming, from the University of Washington. Just fabulous work. We're going to have more books on Feng Shui in the next 5 to 10 years, addressing and answering exactly some of these questions. Now, as to the question of what's going on in the Ming, is it different from the Qing? When does the phenomenon of lawsuits about Feng Shui come to the foreground? This is a very big question. And I have to admit, just in terms of modestly, my book really looks at the Qing and specifically the second half of the Qing. But if I had to take a guess, from what I've read and from what I've learned from colleagues like Ian Miller, who I think is also looking at this book, looking at this question right now, is that during the Song Dynasty, we start to see lawsuits that could be identified as really grappling with some of these Feng Shui technicalities. By the Ming Dynasty, it has become, frankly, routine in the law in parts of South China, especially for courts to process and adjudicate lawsuits and disputes about Feng Shui. Feng Shui disputes appear in litigation manuals from that era and so on. Now, the question is, does the Qing carry on with that? What makes it unique? And what I guess I would say is that we have to remember with the Qing, they didn't register much land. They didn't tax. I mean, the question of what were the tax rates in the Qing is, of course, a fascinating, interesting technical debate. But they certainly didn't register a lot of new land, right? I think that goes without saying. So, and the Qing is also presiding over unprecedented population growth, which doesn't explain everything, to be honest, right? But environmental challenges, the resource scarcity challenges, and so on. So I tend to believe that many of the phenomenon that we certainly see in earlier periods of Chinese history, like the Ming, may have been accentuated in the Qing, especially in the 19th century. But I do think that it remains an open question, and one well worth delving into in greater detail about exactly how is it similar and how is it different. And I'm sure, of course, like anything, it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tristan. The next question comes from one of our students, Sun Jiayue. And he says, thanks, Professor Brown, for your inspiring talk. I'm a student of anthropology, and my research is about carpenters' magic in contemporary Southwest China. Carpenters are apparently immersed in the discourse of Feng Shui, as they are builders of houses. But perhaps interestingly, they are not experts either compared to Feng Shui Xiansheng or Didi Xiansheng. I was wondering if you have encountered any cases related to carpenters. And by the way, in my fieldwork, I found a widespread discourse that the CCP government has built infrastructures to destroy the feng shui, e.g. a pylon in the middle of a mountain, so as to avoid the birth of a great person that might challenge the current regime. That might be an interesting supplement to your final argument. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for this question. It's great. First, let's start with maybe the question about the government at the end, right? Feng Shui still remains a political discourse, right? It still has political implications. That's why, of course, when Xi Jinping announced Shong'an and people went in and started analyzing the feng shui of Shong'an, it's in a flood zone, I guess. Like, does it have good feng shui? Does it have bad feng shui? I think even the previous mayor of Shanghai even openly discussed this question. It was really fascinating. So the question of, is feng shui still relevant to the politics of China? Yes, I think absolutely. And I think exactly scholars of religion, anthropologists such as yourself, have a lot to contribute to our understanding of that. Sometimes political scientists overlook these questions, but they're actually really important for understanding the dynamics of civil society in China. So I think it's a great point. On to the question of carpenters. Absolutely. So there are carpentry manuals from the Ming and Qing dynasties that certainly incorporate feng shui knowledge. Also calendrical knowledge, auspicious days to begin construction, inauspicious days to begin construction, so on and so forth, directions. I'll give you one example, for instance, that I have a suspicion about is granaries, right? The position of granaries, I believe, was quite important, and they were specifically selected because the direction of the sun and exposure to the elements really matters for the storage of grain. So if I was looking at, for instance, questions of feng shui analysis and these kind of like geomantic specialists, I would take a look at the question of granaries. I think that's really interesting. Another place where I've seen it, for instance, you see it in the layout of yamens and county towns all the time, the position of jails, prisons. I discussed this actually kind of in passing in chapter 1. But the idea of prisons being oriented in the western part of the complex, of the yamen complex and everything, that actually seems to have been followed. When I look at gazetteer maps of where, if you look at where they label the prison, where it's located, it's remarkably consistent. So I think there's a lot of potential stuff in terms of actual, like the technical, like the carpenter as technician, carpenter as craftsman. I haven't encountered a legal case explicitly about that. But it's a great topic, and I'll certainly keep an eye out for it. If I see anything, I'll make a mental note to send you an email. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We have a question from our colleague, Professor Billy So. And he says, thanks for the fascinating talk. Does your book touch on the intellectual history issue of the organic order or union between heaven and man, Tianren Heyi, behind feng shui as applied to law, education, knowledge, politics, etc.?
Yeah, this is a fabulous question. I'll just say that insofar as I do, of course, grapple with a bit of the intellectual history of cosmology and cosmological thinking in China. The example of course, the layout of the imperial palace and how that sort of does bear some resonance with the layout of government offices across the empire is like kind of one example of that. I do think that there's a lot more to be done in the intellectual history of feng shui. And I'll just say about this is I think it speaks directly to this, the relationship between people and heaven very well, is we have so many books, and they're good books, about Chinese medicine. We have books about Chinese medicine in the medieval period with Donghua. We have Song Dynasty. We have late imperial. And they're fantastic. But compared to how much do we have about feng shui? Now, we have, Mark Kalinowski, we have people in France. There are people who have done very important work and contributions to the history of Chinese divination. Richard Smith, of course. In Young thought, Robin Wong, et cetera, those folks, they're out there. But if you think about the mountain of material we have about medicine and the relatively modest amount we have for feng shui, in looking at how important feng shui was in Chinese society, in the pre-20th century context, rural society in particular, there's a ton to be done. One question I've talked about with Hua, for instance, is when does the notion of Long Mai, dragon vein, emerge? How did, for instance, the discourse, medical discourse of Mai, of vein or pulse, or how did that influence the development of feng shui ideas? And then in turn, how did the development of feng shui ideas influence medicine? Because in some medical text, we also see information about feng shui. So I think one of the things that I can just say about the intellectual landscape is it's so rich. When I started researching this book, for legal history, we looked at the Great Qing Code, maybe the Da Qing Huidian, Great Ming Code. Of course, we looked at the law codes. We looked at example cases, model cases. These are really important sources for legal historians, and I totally understand why we devoted so much time to them. But then I started to realize religious texts, some medical texts, feng shui texts, they have legal information. And they're just hanging out there for the taking. Because it's like, I never even thought to look at a feng shui manual for discussion of various types of legal punishments, various types of, imperial pardons during even the autumn diseases. Some feng shui manuals even talk about that kind of stuff. It's really remarkable. So I think that, one of the things that strikes me is regarding the intellectual history of feng shui and of this broader cosmology that you speak of, there's a ton that's left to do. Of course, there's great scholars in China, Chen Jingguo and others who have done a lot of work already, but there's still a lot more to do. And I think what's so exciting about it is that it is for graduate students and for young scholars who want to embrace these it's a difficult topic, admittedly, but it's inherently interdisciplinary, right? It's like, look for legal stuff in texts that we wouldn't expect it, right? And we might end up getting a lot. Look for, medical knowledge in, unlikely places. And I think this is a real sort of promising venue, right, for future research. So thank you so much, Billy, for your question.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. You've mentioned her, but we have one question from our very own student, Hua, who's also working on Feng Shui. So she says, hello, Professor Brown, very nice meeting you today. Here's my question. In your book, it seems that Feng Shui knowledge can be divided into two types. One is the localized embodied knowledge. The other is the abstract Feng Shui knowledge incorporated into the state administration system. However, you also mentioned in the preface that standard Feng Shui knowledge had already spread widely across China before the Qing Dynasty. So how can we distinguish between these two types of Feng Shui knowledge? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Hua, for this excellent question, fascinating question. I'll give it my best shot. What I can say is this, right? I mean, and this is something that I think we always have to remember. It's never completely the state. It's never completely the center. It's never completely imperial. But at the same time, it's never completely local either, right? In order to make a feng shui claim persuasive in court, you have to actually appeal to recognized precedent and recognize forms of knowledge that a well-educated, literate official would at least be able to recognize. So I think that the key is looking at how do we distinguish. I think what we can say is there's this constant negotiation between imperial abstract forms, precedent cases, ideal models of feng shui, and local knowledge that takes those, digests them, produces new knowledge. Again, knowledge can circulate up to the center. It can circulate down. It can go in all different directions. Of course, in a lot of feng shui knowledge, it didn't even originate with the quote-unquote Han cultures of the center, right? They were incorporated from minority peoples in Southwest China or Southern China and sort of got reworked in, especially around reburial, I'm sure, as you know. So I think that the question of how local is it? How standard is it? Is one that will continue to animate scholars going forward. But what I wanted to do in this book is I wanted to make one really strong line in the sand, which is sometimes there had been an assumption, especially in the 20th century among some Western scholars, that feng shui was just nonsense, that it was just whatever you wanted to say. People were making things up. And what I realized when I read these cases and I read the manuals and I looked deeply into these two genres is that that was not the case, that they did have patterns. Now, it is important, of course, not to overstress standardization. I follow Michael Soni very closely on this. I agree with him. We don't want to overstress it, right? Clearly, there was a lot of negotiation. There was a lot open to interpretation, no doubt. But there was some structure to feng shui. And I think what's really exciting, what I try to do is I try to show you through 5 chapters what some of that structure looked like. And I think that in your work and in other people's work coming forward in the next 5 to 10 years, we're certainly going to see more examples of that. And I think we'll continue to fill in the gaps. For instance, the Shui-Ko water exit is a great example, right, of a fairly well-established precedent that's widely recognized, right? So thank you so much for your question. And I really look forward to reading your dissertation.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question. This one comes from James St. Andre. And the question is, I wonder to what extent feng shui could be used by those below to challenge those above. I read somewhere that government officials, quote unquote, used feng shui complaints by the people to block foreign developments. But then when they decided themselves to industrialize, they swept aside such considerations. Do you have any thoughts on this? Were there cases of feng shui being used to oppose governmental policies?
Oh, yes, absolutely. This is, again, very, very good question. I mean, one way to think about it is that feng shui objections are a protest, right? They're a protest, right? They're a protest. All, as far as I can tell, nobody ever walks, hundreds of miles to court to bring a case and say, for the sake of feng shui, let's mine more, right? Now, of course, it doesn't mean that mining always hurt feng shui. But it does mean that the cases that at least that I see in the legal archive, are all basically about blocking development. And sometimes the state was willing to agree and block development, and sometimes the state wanted development to happen, in which case they needed to oppose or disagree with the feng shui interpretation. One way in which state actors and also merchants could work around feng shui was by obtaining various kinds of what I call feng shui insurance in the Qing period. I talk about this in chapter 4 of the book. So one way, for instance, is you invite a Taoist priest or another ritual specialist to do a very public ritual, appeasing the mountain deity or holding an opera. There's a variety of ways in which it would be done. And what I can't say that, these rituals always worked or appeased local concerns, but they were performed quite often. And I discuss actually one such mining ritual that was performed in Sichuan during the 19th century to prevent objections to feng shui, to mining on the basis of feng shui. Another way that merchants could ensure themselves against this kind of protest was they would go preemptively to the yamen and ask the yamen to issue a notice saying, for the duration of construction, no feng shui lawsuits will be accepted about this. We've investigated it. It needs to be done. It's going to be done safely. We're not taking, so it's like insurance, right? So what we could say is the state, it's not just in the late 19th century. The Chinese state, the Qing state, constantly was, could play both sides of this equation, right? Sometimes you agree and say, okay, let's not build there, let's not build the dam, let's not cut down that. And sometimes you say, no, we have to. So the key point that I would make is the way in which the Qing state was able to successfully manage with a very small bureaucracy was that it exactly was able to balance these competing demands, in part by engaging feng shui. The problem about the late Qing is that it can no longer do that balancing act. You actually have to kind of say, in order to build these railways, we're going to have to just destroy tens of thousands of grave sites. And it really was tens of thousands of grave sites, and cut down millions of trees. It really was a serious developmental proposal. So I think that what I would say is there are many examples of protests. Sometimes the state endorses it. Sometimes the state opposes it, cracks down on it, complains about it, says the people are obsessed with feng shui and they hate it. They're all over the map, right, in the Ming and Qing eras, I believe, right, the way officials interact with these cases. But I think the key point is they're trying to balance. That's what I see, at least. And I think that balancing act worked, at least seems to have worked somewhat reasonably well until the late Qing, and in which case it's becoming quite existential.
All right, thank you so much. I know that there's still questions, but I'm afraid we've already run out of time, and I'm particularly aware of how late it is in the US now. So I don't want to keep Professor Brown even longer. So what remains for me to do, Tristan, is to just thank you again so much for taking the time to give us such a wonderful introduction to your great book, and also to answer all these questions so patiently. So thank you very much, and also thank you to everyone who was tuning in to this talk. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Ghassan. I really appreciate the invitation again, and to everybody for coming today. I really appreciate it. If you have a question that you didn't have a chance to ask, please feel free to write me an email, and I will try to get back to you this week. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. All right. Bye-bye.